welcome back to our series of spiritual practices. Over the course of this year, we've been exploring many spiritual practices, and for the month of July, we are going to be exploring the spiritual practice of Sabbath. Now, as we start this, I want to ask you a question. What is the tiredest you have ever been? Maybe you have an image in mind. For me, I think of times when I have been at camp for a week. In fact, before Aaron and I started doing youth ministry full time, we had a camp ministry and we would spend the summer doing weeks of camp. So it'd be week of camp, followed by week of camp, followed by week of camp. And I remember being so exhausted and worn out after a week of early mornings and late nights and repeating that over and over. And I was just so exhausted and would sleep for so long once we finally got home again. We all experience exhaustion. It could be just the mundane things in our lives. It could be periods of intense focus because we have a project at work, or maybe you have little kids at home and the new baby is just not sleeping well. There are so many different reasons that we get exhausted. It's part of our humanity that we get tired. But despite the fact that all of us as humans get tired and exhausted, our society is very much anti-rest. Think about the expectation of constant productivity, or constantly achieving something, or having to reach that next promotion, or buy that house, or work harder in school, or play that sport to be able to get that scholarship. Our society has wired us to think that if we're not being productive, if we are not moving up the ranks socially or professionally, that somehow we are doing something wrong. If you rest, or heaven forbid, you spend some time doing nothing or achieving nothing, then sometimes we feel like that's just a complete waste, or we feel like a failure, or we feel weak. But this constant go, this constant pressure to achieve and do is contrary to the rhythm that God calls us to live. God calls his people to rest from the very beginning. The writer of Genesis tells us that on the seventh day of creation, God rested. And so it's no surprise that as he calls his people and brings them out of Egypt, that he calls them to emulate this rhythm of working for 6 days and resting. And we see that in the pages of the Old Testament, God continuing to call his people to this rhythm of rest and renewal. The Sabbath day was intended as a gift to the people, where they could declare their dependence on God and rest in him. Because at the end of the day, we are humans, we are finite, and we can't do everything. And God calls his people to rest in him, to be restored, and to recognize their proper relationship with him, to recognize that we are dependent on him. And as we move into the New Testament, we see Jesus and his disciples taking time for rest. They took time for rest after seasons of being poured out in ministry. Jesus often sought time alone for solitude and silence to pray, but we see him and his disciples seeking out rest. Jesus taught about rest. In Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30, he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So here, even the words of Jesus are reminding us that there is a rhythm, God's rhythm, that calls for periods of work and rest, for holy, soul replenishing rest. But it is so elusive for most of us, because we have pressures of deadlines, we have responsibilities. There are definitely good things that we have to do, taking care of children, serving at church, lots of good things that we do. But we get tired, and we need to take times of Sabbath. Take time to come to Jesus with our burdens and our weariness and let him restore us. Because following Jesus is not an easy path. We get tired just from serving and loving others and trying to follow and live our lives in the pattern of Jesus. And so if we're not careful and we don't take care of ourselves, we can find ourselves in a burned out, exhausted place. And that's why I think developing a rhythm of Sabbath in our lives is so important. It helps us spiritually. It also helps us physically, emotionally, mentally. Helps us in all of the ways. So how are we to practice Sabbath? I mean, we're not Jewish. We aren't living in Israel with a national rhythm of things shutting down for Sabbath. Our society is not structured for this. Stores are open 24/7. I mean, it seems to me that we keep inventing more things to make ourselves more productive, to be able to work longer and longer and stay connected more and more. And while electricity is certainly good and technology has lots of benefits, I think it is always important for us to stop and pause and think about how it is impacting the rhythm that God is calling us to, the very rhythm that we are living. So when I say Sabbath, what do I mean for us as followers of Jesus in 2025? Well, at its basis, Sabbath is ceasing from working, from striving, from consuming, from buying, and also from ceasing from worry and stress, and instead replacing those things for a time with activities that are soul replenishing, that are restful, that fill us up, and help us to be ready to keep going. One writer I was reading this week called Sabbath holy leisure or holy rest. So it's not, I'm just not going to do anything and I'm going to be alone with my thoughts. That's not what it is, because Sabbath can be practiced in community. It can be practiced in community with your family, with friends, or with our church family. We can Sabbath together. We also can Sabbath individually. When we're practicing Sabbath, we are declaring our dependence on our Creator, and we're acknowledging our limits, because we are human. We are finite. We do not have endless amounts of energy or time or health. We are limited, but God is not. And so when we choose to practice Sabbath and rest in Him, we are acknowledging that He is bigger, that He is at work, and He doesn't need us to wear ourselves to the bone, striving and struggling forward. He wants us to rest in Him. So how do we actually practice this? For me, this has been a new practice, and as a family, we've tried it as a family. We have done it, Aaron and I have done it individually, and it has been a continual learning experience. The practice of Sabbath is unique to each person and to each family, because things that I find restful, someone else may not. Some people, gardening is a restful, life-giving activity. Other people, it's not. It just becomes something they have to check off their to-do list. We don't want to be doing the activities that we feel like are check off our to-do list. Some of the other things I find restful are drawing or painting. But for someone else, it might be having the time to bake or make a meal from scratch. Or perhaps hosting is your thing and you want to have a group of friends over so that you can spend time together and play a board game. All of these things can be Sabbath activities. Now, if you start to think about it, they may sound a little bit like hobbies. And in some ways they are, but what differentiates Sabbath practices from hobbies is our intention. So like my intention for painting would be to be with God while I'm doing it. The best example I can think of is that sometimes running is a Sabbath for me. And I will go out on a run, and I'll just invite Jesus to run with me. Like, Jesus, will you just run with me today? And and I can't tell you that I'm just having this really like in-depth conversation, but I have this sense of his presence with me as I'm running. And sometimes we talk, sometimes I'm just running and I just know he's with me. And so it's doing those practices, those activities, aware of God's presence and with the intentionality of being with him. So, my challenge for us for the month of July is for each week in July to try to find a block of 2 to 4 hours to practice Sabbath. Now, you can do this alone, you can do this with your family, or you can do this with some friends, but to intentionally practice Sabbath for a 2 to 4 hour block each week of the month of July. Regardless of what activity you decide to do, I want you to begin it with intention. And this could look like reading Matthew 11:28 through 30, and praying and just asking God to restore you and refresh you. And then maybe you go on and you're hanging out with friends and you're being aware of the joy and the life-giving nature of being with people you love. And God, you recognize God's presence with you in that, and you're filled up and restored and rejuvenated. Or maybe you need a nap and you just go and take a nap in the middle of the afternoon and you let God restore you in that. But regardless of what you do, I encourage you to be intentional about noticing God's presence with you while you do it. And I encourage you to move more slowly than you normally would. You're moving at a different pace, God's pace. Our world is fast paced. Our world demands productivity, it demands achievement. So I encourage you to examine those practices, those activities that you want to do, and make sure that they are not achievement oriented, or that you're not, oh, I got to check these things off my to-do list and calling them Sabbath practice. You want it to be intentionally set apart time. And it isn't necessarily the easiest practice to work in. I mean, ideally, it would be a one whole day every week, but that is very challenging. And that's not something that I am very good at doing. Usually I can manage a few hours, and that's about it. So our challenge is to do 2 to 4 hours of Sabbath practice each week of July, and just see what God does in your midst while you take this time to be with him this month. So as you set out to practice Sabbath this month, may these hours of restful, holy leisure awaken our hearts to our dependence on our Creator and reorient our lives according to his rhythm.